All right, today we are diving deep into the fascinating work of psychoanalyst Piera Aulagnier and her really provocative idea about the violence of interpretation. And her work kicks off with one of the biggest questions you could possibly ask. I mean, really think about that. How does it happen? We start out as these tiny biological beings, totally dependent, and somehow we become us, people with thoughts, a sense of self, a past, a future. How does that switch get flipped?
Okay, I know what you're thinking. Violence? That sounds pretty intense, right? But hold on, because for Aulagnier, this isn't the kind of violence we normally think of. It's actually a creative, foundational act, something that's absolutely vital for us to become human in the first place.
So Aulagnier says this whole process starts with what she calls a spokesperson, the portavoz. This is usually the mother. And she takes all the infant's raw biological experiences, hunger, being cold, hearing a loud noise, and she interprets them. When she says, "Oh, you must be hungry," or "that noise scared you, didn't it?" she's doing more than just guessing. She is literally giving those sensations a psychic meaning. She's speaking for the baby, long before it can ever speak for itself.
And all these words, these interpretations, they cast what Aulagnier calls an identifying shadow over the infant. It's like this interpretation gets projected onto the child, and that becomes the very first blueprint for an identity. The baby starts to have a psychic life only because someone else is thinking about it and speaking to it. And that is the essential primary violence she's talking about. An outside meaning being forced onto a purely biological feeling.
So let's dig into this, because this is where Aulagnier makes a really crucial distinction. Not all of this interpretive violence is created equal. There's a necessary, life-giving kind, and then there's a destructive, even soul-crushing kind.
And you can see the two paths right here. On one side, you've got primary violence. This is the good stuff, the creative stuff. It's what takes that raw experience and gives it meaning so a subject, a person, can be born. But on the other side, you have secondary violence. And this is the destructive kind. It's when the interpretation is way too much, when it forces a kid into a rigid box and basically denies them the right to have their own thoughts. It's the difference between helping a mind take shape and just declaring that you already know everything it thinks.
Aulagnier points out that this whole process starts with the spokesperson herself. I mean, the mother isn't a blank slate, right? She's a person with her own history, her own baggage, her own unconscious desires and things she's repressed. So when she interprets her child, it's never a neutral act. It's always colored by her own inner world. And this isn't some kind of mistake. It's just how human meaning gets passed down.
I love this metaphor she used, a harlequin's habit. Think of a clown's costume, just a bunch of mismatched patches sewn together. Aulagnier says that's what happens when theories or a parent's interpretations get too rigid and dogmatic. They might look colorful, but they're just an empty shell. All the real life, the joy, and the value has been drained out of them. And that, right there, is the very heart of secondary violence. So, this leads us to the real nail-biter. What happens when the spokesperson's message isn't just a little biased, but is deeply contradictory or just plain overwhelming? What happens when that necessary, creative violence turns into that destructive, secondary kind? Well, Aulagnier says that when this first interpretation goes wrong, when the message doesn't make sense, when there's a big logical hole in it, the mind that's just starting to form has to figure out some way to deal with it. And that response leads down to very, very different psychological roads.
It pretty much unfolds in 3 steps. First, the child gets a message from their spokesperson that's just impossible. A message that says, for example, "I love you" and "I hate you" at the very same time. Second, the child's psyche has to do something to solve this contradiction. It can't just leave it alone. And third, that desperate solution leads to a fork in the road, heading toward one of 2 outcomes, what Aulagnier calls psychosis, or perversion.
So let's look at that first path, psychosis. When a person is faced with a totally contradictory message from their caregiver, the other, the psychotic subject doesn't just reject it. No, they try to fix it.
And what this means from Aulagnier's point of view is that a delusion isn't just random madness. It's actually a profoundly creative act.
It is a desperate attempt to build a brand new meaning, a whole new theory about how the world works that can patch over that gaping logical hole left by the spokesperson. It's an attempt to make reality make sense again.
All right, so that's one path. But the second path, perversion, uses a completely different playbook for dealing with that flawed message.
The key mechanism here is called disavowal. Now, this is different from repression, where you just push a thought away. With disavowal, you hold two totally contradictory ideas in your head at the same time. You literally see one thing, but you believe another. The classic psychoanalytic example, and yes, it's a controversial one, is a child who sees that their mother is anatomically different from their father, but at the same time holds on to the belief that she's the same, basically disavowing the reality right in front of them.
So you see the difference? The psychotic subject tries to repair the flawed message from the parent, but the perverse subject sees the contradiction in the law of the other, the parent, society, whatever. And instead of fixing it, they embrace the contradiction and choose to defy that law head-on.
And this is why, for Aulagnier, the perverse subject doesn't think of their actions as a symptom of some illness. No, they reclaim them. They say, this is a choice. This is my truth, in direct defiance of what everyone else says is normal. They're basically saying, your rules are broken, so I'm making my own.
Okay, so after walking through how we're literally spoken into existence, the necessary violence of that whole process, and these two intense paths of psychosis and perversion, we finally get to Aulagnier's most powerful and, I think, most important conclusion. It's an idea about the very foundation of thought itself.
All of these different threads, the mother's voice, that identifying shadow, the way the psyche responds to crisis, they all weave together to point to the one single thing that is required for any of us to actually, truly think for ourselves.
And for Aulagnier, it really all boils down to this single, powerful line. The absolute, non-negotiable condition for being able to think authentically is the right to a secret.
So let's just recap the big takeaways here. Our entire sense of self is built on the primary violence of other people interpreting us. But to develop our own independent thoughts, to be truly ourselves, we have to carve out a private inner world. This right to a secret is our only defense against that secondary violence, the kind that comes from an other who wants to know everything, to control everything we think. What this really means is that genuine thinking isn't just about being smart or logical. It's about having a private mental space, a little secret garden in your mind where you are free to think things that the other, whether it's your parents or your culture, doesn't know about, or wouldn't approve of, or doesn't want you to think. If you don't have that, you're not really thinking for yourself. You're just a spokesperson for thoughts someone else put there.
And so, that leaves us with a final, pretty unsettling question to chew on. If our very first thoughts were literally given to us, imposed on us by someone else, then how can any of us ever be sure which of our deeply held beliefs, our most precious ideas, are really truly our own, and which are just the echoes of a voice we heard a long, long time ago?